I'm drunk, and I actually laid on her and like held her, like detained her kind of, and she ended up like leaving, but that happened that night.
The words fell into the void, not loud, not urgent, but enough to make the whole room cold. No screams, no blood, just a vague confession amid scattered memories. Around 2 a.m. that morning, a girl was found unconscious in her apartment near the University of Virginia campus. No signs of forced entry, no scratches, no cries for help. Just a phone dropped on the floor and a half-open eye, not yet closed. Yeardley Love, 22, a senior, stood out both on the sports field and in the classroom. The last person to text her, someone who had loved her deeply and who she had once abandoned. But what made things confusing was that confession. Why would someone who only wanted to keep her make things impossible to return to the way they were? That evening, the sky above Charlottesville was covered in gray clouds. It wasn't raining, but the air was thick and heavy. In the student housing area near the University of Virginia, a few windows were still lit, and the alleys were quiet. Just before 11 p.m., a dark-colored car slowly pulled into the parking lot next to Building C, where Yeardley Love, a senior, lived alone. Security cameras at the corner of the intersection captured the car passing at 10:47 p.m. The license plate was clearly visible, but the person behind the wheel was too dark to identify. No one paid attention. No one was standing nearby to witness. About an hour later, Yeardley stopped texting or answering her phone. This was described by friends as unusual. She usually texted goodnight or responded to text messages late, but that night everything was quiet. Her phone showed only one missed call at 11:47 from a number that had been saved but had recently been deleted. Soon after, neighbors downstairs reported hearing a deep thud, like something heavy hitting a wall. The noise lasted only a few seconds, then stopped. There was no screaming, no crashing. No one called the police because the sound could easily have been mistaken for the sounds of student housing. Meanwhile, upstairs, no one knew what was really going on inside Yeardley's apartment. All the appliances were working. The doors had not been forced open. Everything was too quiet. Too quiet. At around 2 a.m., a witness passing by the building noticed a man leaving the main gate. He was wearing a dark jacket, a baseball cap pulled low, and his hands in his pockets. His gait was unhurried, but there was something about it that made onlookers turn to look, as if he were trying to keep his breathing even, or to hide something. No one in the building could remember anyone visiting Yeardley that night. No music, no conversation. Every clue was as thin as mist. It was a night when everything seemed normal, but the normality was deceptive, a silence too perfect. A moment that no one knew would become a defining moment in a young girl's life. On the morning of May 3rd, the sky over Charlottesville had turned from gray to pale blue. Before the first rays of sunlight had penetrated the curtains, Yeardley's roommate, Katie Whiteley, returned to her apartment after spending the night at her boyfriend's. She opened the door and stepped into the familiar space, but immediately sensed something was different. Not a sound, not a strange smell, but an unnatural silence. The hallway light was still on. Yeardley's shoes were in the doorway. She called out to her friend, but there was no response. The bedroom door was ajar. When Katie pushed it open, she froze. On the small bed by the window, Yeardley lay on her side, motionless, one cheek pressed against the pillow. Her skin was pale, her arm hanging limply over the edge of the bed. The pillow was stained darkly, and the screen of her phone had fallen face down onto the wooden floor. Katie backed away, panicked. She called a classmate over to help her determine the situation. Minutes later, they picked up the phone and called 911. The call began with a gasp. Philippe, the friend who had just arrived, said in a shaky voice, "She's not moving. I don't think she's breathing." The dispatcher asked again, "Is she responsive? Does she have a pulse?" The answer was quiet. Nothing. The rescue team arrived at about 2:26 a.m. They entered the apartment without breaking the lock. Everything was intact. No signs of displacement, no objects dropped or broken. But when they entered the bedroom, something caught the paramedics' attention. In addition to Yeardley's motionless form, there was a faint red mark on her neck and an ill-defined mark on her left jaw. At that moment, the police were called in. The first responders noted no broken door, no disturbance, no obvious signs of a struggle. But the quiet of the apartment seemed to hide something deeper. Police immediately cordoned off the scene and recorded every detail, from the location of the phone to the slightly askew blanket. When Katie was asked when she had last seen Yeardley, she replied, "About 10 p.m. the night before. Said she was going to bed early. Nothing out of the ordinary." But later that afternoon, that statement, which seemed like a simple timeline, became the starting point for a series of surprising discoveries. Little did anyone know at the time that the first statement would be the clue that would set things on a new course. When the forensic team approached the scene, everything initially seemed too neat. The apartment was small, the walls were white, the light was soft yellow. There were no signs of a struggle or rummaging. The bedsheet was flat, the pillow was in the right place. But for those who were used to seeing the truth hidden under the calm exterior, it was that normality that was suspicious. The victim's phone fell on the corner of the bed. The glass cracked diagonally. There were no obvious signs of collision around. Under the desk was a strange pair of men's shoes, not the same size as the rest of hers. In the corner of the room, there was an abandoned glass of water. The fingerprints did not match her roommate. There was no blood, but the faint fingerprint-like mark on the door left the impression that someone had held it very tightly before leaving. The autopsy results forced the investigation team to review the entire timeline. The time of death was determined to be around 11:50 p.m., nearly 3 hours earlier than the 911 call. This raised questions about the victim's early-to-bed claim, as well as the gap in time between when she lay down on the bed and when she was discovered. The victim's neck had a slight bruise, but no deep bruises or signs of a struggle. In particular, there was a short but deep scratch on her left shoulder, located near the strap of her nightgown that had been pulled askew. A crescent-shaped scratch appeared on her right wrist, not strong enough to cause serious injury, but obvious enough to make investigators question her. There were no unknown toxins in her blood, no signs of drugging, but in the victim's right hand, technicians found a short, light-colored hair, not matching Yeardley's hair color. DNA analysis later determined it was male. And then, a small detail on her wrist, a circular mark, like the back of a metal watch, set the investigation on a completely different course. Immediately after receiving the preliminary forensic report and examining the scene, Charlottesville police began an in-depth investigation. They were looking for more than a name, but a series of clues that could connect the dots, pieces that could be pieced together into a system. The first to compile a list of people who had been in close contact with the victim in the 48 hours before she was found was her roommate, her coach, her classmates, and even people who had been romantically involved with her. One name quickly stood out: George Hughley. George was Yeardley's ex-boyfriend. They were both students at Virginia, playing on the prestigious lacrosse team. They had been a popular couple, but their relationship had been rocky. Friends said they had been arguing frequently, and Yeardley had cut off all contact less than a week before the incident. When police first approached George, he seemed cooperative. He claimed he hadn't seen Yeardley in days. "I was home all night. Didn't go anywhere," he said, his eyes fixed but his voice strained, as if he were measuring each word. But an hour later, investigators discovered security cameras from a house across the street from Yeardley's building, showing a tall man in a dark sweatshirt and baseball cap entering the building around midnight, a gait that closely matched George's. Immediately, a formal interview was made. This time, George was brought into an interrogation room at the police station. No handcuffs, no lawyer present. He maintained that he was merely assisting the investigation. In the interrogation room, the investigator, an experienced policewoman named Lisa, started with gentle questions. "What did you do last night? Anyone confirm?" George repeated his old answers: home, watching TV, then going to bed. But when Lisa produced a printout of the camera footage, George's expression changed. One moment of shock, then defensiveness. "I just came to talk. Nothing happened," he said, rubbing his knee. The interrogation lasted nearly 3 hours. During that time, George changed his story 3 times. He refused to meet her, admitted to stopping by, then confessed to going into the apartment, having a little argument, and pushing her against the wall. He didn't mention that Yeardley had passed out. "I think she just wanted me to leave." When asked, "Did you touch her neck?" George hesitated, then slowly said, "I may have held her a little. I don't remember. I didn't mean to hurt her." That sentence, not loud, not clear, but it was the piece that matched the light bruise mark found on the victim's neck. Investigator Lisa didn't stop there. She switched to psychological manipulation. A thick file was placed on the table, unopened, but placed there as a signal. Lisa said, "In Yeardley's room, there is a cup with fingerprints on it. The technical police will check it. If it's yours, can you explain?" George bowed his head. No answer. Immediately after, when Lisa asked, "Did you ever sit on her to hold her down?" George replied, almost in a whisper, "I lay on her for a while, like to calm her down." The answer clarified part of the timeline and also raised the larger question: if it was just holding, why did the girl never wake up? The police then gathered more evidence. A hair sample from the victim's hand matched George's DNA. A shoe print outside the balcony door almost exactly matched a pair of sneakers George owned. A message had been deleted from Yeardley's phone, but was recovered from the server. It contained a heated conversation between the two before the incident. A particular point that turned the investigation around was the roommate's testimony. "She told me he used to come to the house in the middle of the night, knocking very hard. Sometimes Yeardley would double lock the door because he was scared." The police then compared his habits and history of approaching the area and realized that this was not the first time George had come unannounced. Finally, with enough evidence, George Yeardley was formally arrested. The warrant was not issued for premeditated murder, but for the alleged use of force resulting in death. What made the incident all the more heartbreaking was that it had all happened in silence. No screams, no obvious serious injuries. But the little details connected. The contradictory statements painted a true picture. And when the police turned the final page of the file, what made them certain was not the big clues, but a simple, quiet sentence repeated over and over in the interrogation room. "I didn't mean it. I just wanted her to hear me." In February 2012, nearly 2 years after the incident, George Yeardley's trial officially began in Charlottesville. More than 100 people attended the first session. Local and national media were present. The audience was packed. The atmosphere in the courtroom was tense, not because of the noise, but because of the silence of anticipation. From the very beginning, the prosecution presented the core evidence. The defendants altered testimony, the camera footage, the matching DNA sample, and especially the 64-minute video recording the entire interrogation process. In it, George admitted to lying on top of Yeardley to hold her down, and maybe touching her neck. They emphasized no weapon, no hard blow. It was the pressure and the wrong behavior that led to the tragic outcome. The defense argued against this argument. They described George as a young, emotionally immature man in turmoil over a broken relationship. They asserted that George's actions were not motivated by malice or an intention to cause harm, but rather a spontaneous, uncontrolled reaction. They said this was a tragic accident, not a murder in the legal sense. In a particularly dramatic moment, Yeardley's mother, Sharon, was invited to speak. She did not cry. In a calm but firm voice, she spoke of a girl who dreamed of becoming a teacher, loved sports, and always believed in kindness. The room fell silent. After 9 days of deliberation and 10 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict. George Yeardley was guilty of second-degree manslaughter, with a sentence of 26 years in prison. The court did not find that he had any intention to kill, but determined that his actions directly caused death. The verdict sparked controversy. Some felt the sentence was too lenient, that if the roles of victim and perpetrator had been reversed, the punishment would have been different. Others saw it as a step forward in the law, clearly distinguishing between intent to kill and dangerous conduct with consequences. For Yeardley's family, justice never seemed to be enough, but in their eyes, the pain was no longer about revenge. Instead, they chose to turn the loss into a warning that violence does not always make a sound, and sometimes what hurts the most is silence. Yeardley Love died at the age of 22, with a life full of promise ahead of her. There was no clear warning, no final distress call. It all ended in silence, in the small room she once called home. And the most heartbreaking thing is that the last person she spoke to was not a stranger. The Yeardley family lost not only a child, but years that she deserved to live. Unfulfilled dreams, opportunities that would never return. They did not choose to retaliate. They chose to make a difference. They established an education fund, and they shared Yeardley's story with thousands of other students so that no one else would have to face the same pain. The case is not only a wake-up call about violence in personal relationships, but also reflects a deeper problem: the distortion of perception, emotions, and boundaries. Sometimes the people who hurt us the most are the ones who were closest to us, and sometimes an action that only lasted a few minutes has consequences that last forever. Thanks to technology, forensic evidence, and surveillance data, the truth is out. But could we have prevented it? The question is not who was wrong, but how many chances did we have to avoid this situation that no one took?